Okay, I think we're live. Ladies and gentlemen, this is our quick little snow day presentation to get us caught up on a few little things that we missed. So let us begin. So we're in the notes, the wrapping up the road to the Civil War. That's the Unit 4, Part 3. And we just finished with Harriet Beecher Stowe. And the next thing that you would put in your notes before it says Bleeding Kansas is that you have to realize that America was becoming divided between two pretty radical groups. You had radical abolitionists who wanted to end slavery right away, as soon as possible, weren't willing to stop the fight until they could end it. And that's people like Frederick Douglass and also the newspaper editor William Lloyd Garrison, who wrote a newspaper called The Liberator with stories all about liberation. These guys were radicals, though. They didn't represent a majority at this point. And the opposite end of the spectrum would have been the fire eaters, Southerners who wanted to do anything they could to keep slavery in action. Now, the next big issue is Bleeding Kansas. It's the Civil War before the Civil War. And as you can see from these red and blue spots, there's attacks by pro-slavery forces, attacks by free state forces. This was that whole popular sovereignty idea. Let Kansas vote if they want to have slavery. Problem is, you have pro-slavery people pouring into the state to support it, anti-slavery people pouring into the state to support it, and the whole thing becomes a huge, big mess. There were fights and battles, and it was epic. It was terrible. It was horrific. Kansas ends up voting on a slavery constitution, which leads to all kinds of trouble. Why was Kansas voting in the first place? You might recall the Missouri Compromise, or the Compromise of 1820, said anything north of that line was never supposed to have slavery. And here they are. In 1854, they passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. That changed everything. It basically said that Kansas and Nebraska should be allowed to choose. They should be allowed to vote, make it a democratic choice whether or not we're going to have slavery. One of the figures at Bleeding Kansas, of course, let me go back there for a second, is John Brown. Look at those eyes. Look at that stare. He was a famous figure. We'll talk about him in just a minute, but he was an anti-slavery. He was an abolitionist, and he led a very heroic defense of people being attacked, something like 10 to 1, outnumbered by 10 to 1 by the pro-slavery forces. But he was also accused of a bloody massacre of pro-slavery folks as well. It was war. It was nasty stuff going on. But we'll come back to him in a minute. The next little bit in our notes is Senator Brooks and Charles Sumner, known as the crime against Kansas. Senator Sumner was a Republican, very anti-slavery. He made some disparaging remarks against the Democrats and against the Southern slave owners. And our friend here, the bully Brooks, Preston Brooks, got up out of his seat with his walking cane and just boom, bam, started beating the living daylights out of Sumner. His cane broke. He kept hitting him until he was bloody in the head. It was a really ugly moment in Congress. Things were turning violent. They pulled him off of him, but the damage was done. Sumner had some serious permanent brain damage. He went away to England for a couple of years to recover. He will go on to become a great radical Republican in the rebuilding after the Civil War process. And Sumner, Brooks, the bully, will just kind of be relegated to the side steps of history. Although he was quite a hero in the South, people sent him hundreds, if not thousands, of new canes in the mail. That year, too, 1854, the birth of the Republican Party. Brand new party. It was the Northern Whigs because the Whig Party was gone. A lot of Northern Democrats. They couldn't support the Southern Democrats anymore. You had a lot of the Free Soilers, any of those little independent anti-slavery parties. They would join this as well. And also people who opposed this Kansas-Nebraska Act. And they are one of the fastest growing parties in history. They go from a brand new party in 54 to, well, I'll tell you what happens in their next election. We'll get there in just a moment. Abolition, I want to remind you, had been a big part of politics in the 40s and 50s. We start with one called the Liberty Party. The Liberty Party only for one election, and then we have the Free Soil Party, and then all of this sort of morphs into the Republican Party, again born in 1854. So we now have the two major parties that we still have today. So as I said, their first big election, presidential election of 56, you've got James Buchanan, and he's running against the first ever Republican, and there is a third party guy there, and he's on a new party known as the Know Nothings, or the they have another name as well. We'll get to that in just a second. The American Party, thank you. And here's how they did. Well, these guys were nativists. Here's who they were. They were anti-immigrant. They were afraid of anybody Catholic, Irish, Italian, anything like that. They talked about America for Americans, but of course they didn't mean Native Americans. They were anti a lot of stuff. They had they called themselves the Secret Order of the Star-Spangled Banner. If you ever saw the gangs in New York, that's these guys. They played a big part of the movie. This is what it looked like. So your sort of racist anti-immigrant party managed to get almost 1 million votes. Great. And then the Republican, even though he loses, it's something of a victory because it's their first ever run as a national party, and look how well they did. James Buchanan, who will later become known as one of our least successful, worst presidents in history, will win, but not by a whole lot. The Dred Scott case. This is the worst, well, one of the worst Supreme Court cases in U.S. history. Dred Scott was a slave who was suing for his freedom. His argument was his owner took him into a free state, and slavery is illegal, so therefore he can't be considered a slave. Well, this goes to the Supreme Court, and they find, I'm sorry to report, they find that, well, he can't even go to the Supreme Court because he's not human, he's property. And property can't sue, and you can't take away property. The Supreme Court essentially unravels the Compromise of 1850 and the Compromise of 1820 by saying that anywhere there can be slaves. You can't really make laws about people's property in this way. And so it's a messy court case that's not respected at all in the North and has never been referred to since the Civil War. But again, it essentially argued that African Americans weren't citizens, that they weren't even people, that they were property, and as such had no right to even sue. And I put a quote in your notes, which I think is a really important one. David Walker, an African-American abolitionist, anti-slavery fighter, he wrote, "There was no slavery in history, even that of the Israelites in Egypt, worse than the slavery of the black man in America. Show me a page of history, either sacred or profane, on which a verse can be found which maintains that the Egyptians heaped the insupportable insult upon the children of Israel by telling them that they were not of the human family." Within a year, he was found dead at his doorstep somewhere in Boston. So even in the North, there was plenty of racism and tensions against the abolitionists. The Lincoln-Douglas debates, I'm not going to really go into those in detail, but just suffice it to know, if those are in your notes, or even if they're not, just to add them in there, that this politician, Abraham Lincoln, comes back on the scene after the Mexican-American War had kind of buried him, and he runs against this short little guy, Stephen Douglas. And Stephen Douglas was a pretty big national politician, and so Lincoln thrusts himself into the national stage, does a great job in these debates where he argues very passionately against slavery, although he's not saying we should make slavery illegal in the South, he just wants to not spread any slavery, where Stephen Douglas wants to allow people to choose whether or not the new territories can have slavery. Lincoln loses this election for the Senate. Douglas wins, but Lincoln really becomes famous, makes lots of famous statements. There's a little political cartoon. It just sort of shows them racing actually towards the Capitol in this case. Later, they'll meet again as they run for president, and the next time Lincoln's going to beat little Mr. Douglas. The last thing I think on here that we're going to talk about is Harper's Ferry. Yes, one of the most famous moments in American history, and one of my favorite paintings in American history. This is in the Smithsonian. There you have John Brown again. Him and a group of radical abolitionists decided that they were going to start a revolution. They stormed the South. They raided Harper's Ferry, which was an ammo dump, essentially. They got all these weapons, and then their alleged plan was to then go and free slaves, give them weapons, and start an insurrection that was going to spread across the entire South. They never got past Harper's Ferry. They were surrounded by various militias and then the U.S. Army, and then they were captured, and then they were tried. He was found guilty of treason, and he was hung, executed. It's interesting to note that there was all kinds of different responses to John Brown. A lot of Northerners saw him as a hero. The Transcendentalists thought of him as this great hero who risked and lost his life fighting for freedom. Abraham Lincoln basically just said that he was a tragic figure who made some mistakes and shouldn't have done what he did. And it was the federal government with Lincoln's support that did have him hung. The Southerners, of course, thought he was a terrorist and the worst kind of human being. A lot of people just said he was plain insane. But here's the thing. He was hung because he tried to, with the force of arms, end slavery in the South, which you could argue was more or less exactly what Abraham Lincoln and the U.S. government would then do the following year. Use arms and weapons to then eventually end slavery in the South. This was a big deal. All across the world, there were international protests. He was quite the hero around the world. Victor Hugo spoke out in his favor. This is a lithograph which made it a reprintable poster you saw all over the North. And it has him in this sort of biblical-like stature, the woman offering the baby up to him right as he's about to be hung. This is the famous painting again with the Bible in one hand and the gun in the other. And they're off to end slavery, and then behind him is the Civil War unfolding. So in some ways, people were saying he's the man who started the war. There's a famous song about him that later became another famous tune, and I'll play it for just a little part of the song for you. But we do know that some of the Union regiments, those who really believed in ending slavery, would sing the song of John Brown's body as they went marching into battle. Here's a little bit of it. See if this works. Didn't actually play. So I'll go back to the lyrics. John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave, but his soul goes marching on. Anyways, that's kind of where we are on this. For 2 quick minutes, I want you to turn back to slave resistance, because we skipped that as well, and I think this is really important. There were multiple kinds of resistance to slavery. This is before the Civil War starts. And one of the famous ones is actually just the image of the Sambo character. It's the cartoon. It's meant as an insult, right? It's the caricature with the big face, and he's goofy and acts dumb and stupid. But of course, this was a form of passive resistance where a lot of African Americans and slaves would pretend to kind of play this role, because then little was expected of them and little was asked of them. And so they would play into it, and it played off of them, and so on and so forth. The church was critical to resistance during this time period, right? Slave churches existed illegally on every single plantation, right? And African Americans weren't supposed to learn to read or write, but there were almost always one minister, a secret minister in each plantation. And these would become the leaders of the African American community when slavery was ended. And they play a huge role also during the Civil War in helping to lead resistance and to encourage slaves to run away from their plantations and things like that. They emphasized the gospel of freedom. Slaves weren't allowed to marry, and yet they would gather and have informal marriages and musical celebrations. Jumping over the broomstick, to this day, the African American community remembers this tradition, often in their marriages, by having the broomstick jumping tradition, as you can see in these pictures here. Running away. Sabotage and runaway are the next 2 big things after the church. Sabotage is breaking your tools, breaking machinery, doing what you could to mess things up. Running away through the Underground Railroad was a really big deal. Remember, you had to go all the way to Canada or Mexico, or you could hide in the Everglades or the Great Dismal Swamp. But to really be safe, you had to make it out of the country. The South was obsessed with trying to stop this. And then we have the outright slave rebellions. And there's this big argument. Were there a lot of them? Were there too few of them? I would argue that there were a lot of them when you consider just the risks. If you even tried this and you didn't succeed, you were going to die. And to succeed, what does that mean? Does that mean defeating the entire South, a group of slaves? Or does that mean just killing a bunch of your owners and then getting away to the north, to Canada or to Mexico? The biggest, most famous ones, I'm going to go over 4 or 5 of them really quick. In 1800, Gabriel Prosser plotted a rebellion, but got caught, turned in by some of his own co-conspirators. So he was killed and hung. He used the language of the Bible and the Declaration of Independence. There's also this one here, 1811, the German Coast Uprising in New Orleans. This is one of the biggest in U.S. history. They were also defeated by more than 500 rose up. Then we have 1822, Denmark-Vesey. Again, using the Bible and the Declaration of Independence, they rose up, were successful for about a couple of hours, and then they were caught, and everybody was pretty much executed. And then one of the most famous, that's back to 1811. Sorry, I put these out of order. The most famous in history is going to be Nat Turner. Nat Turner of 1831 in Virginia. He becomes the subject of a famous Ice Cube rap song in the 1990s. He says that he likes Nat, Huey, Malcolm, and Lewis. I asked my friends back then if they could tell me who Nat, Huey, Malcolm, or Lewis were, and people could maybe name Malcolm X. Nat Turner, Huey Newton of the Black Panthers, and Louis Farrakhan. But anyways, we're talking about Nat Turner. Nat Turner organizes this uprising that killed more than 60 whites across the region. And then, of course, he is caught. Him and all of his co-conspirators are hung, executed, tortured, all kinds of horrible things. But it really spreads fear throughout large parts of the South. And a lot of people in the South blame the North. Oh, they're encouraging insurrection. But of course, we know the reality is that probably slaves didn't need help from the North to decide to rise up. There were even discussions of making slavery illegal because it was too dangerous. But they decided instead harsher control, harsher repression, and more violence. We have wrapped this up, 14 minutes. Hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you tomorrow.